Hey guys, how's it going? Toofty here, and today we're looking at the Juicy Lucy, the loose cannon, that's right. I wanted to go back and look at some of the Demoman's core weaponry again because I did it a long time ago, right at the beginning of my channel, but I never went into much depth on each of his weapons, and of course my opinions will have changed since then, so I've been playing around with his weapons, spending a good few days with them so I can bring you my thoughts, and today we're going to look at, the stats very quickly, give you an overview of what my thoughts are, look at the strengths and weaknesses, and then finally we're going to end on some lovely juicy tips. Now obviously bear in mind, whatever topic I take a look at for TF2 is bound to have already been covered to some extent, but I hope at least I can bring maybe some new ideas to this topic, or at the very least my personal perspective and thoughts. Okay, so let's crack on with the video. So my pet peeve is when a TF2 video just lists a bunch of stats for a weapon. So here's my breakdown of the stats. We're not going to spend too long on this, but here's a very quick slide I put together. Grenade launcher on the left, loose cannon on the right. I won't read this out, but one thing worth mentioning is that the projectile speed of the loose cannon is 20% faster, something I didn't realise personally, I never noticed that in my gameplay. The damage for the loose cannon is slightly less unless you get that double donk, and of course you get that pushback, which is a huge factor as well. So that's all I wanted to show you in terms of the stats. Let's move on to a kind of an overview of my thoughts. I'm going to start off with a one-sentence summary, so if you're in a rush, just listen to this and you'll be good to go. So my opinion is that the loose cannon is a fun, situational side grade once you have adjusted. There you go, you're welcome. As always, it's a trade-off, right? So at a high level, you're trading off the immediate burst damage you get with a pipe to the face, the range you get with your grenade launcher, and you're gaining knockback, and you're gaining more damage when you get that double donk. So for me, those were the two key sacrifices, range and immediate burst damage. Another trade-off that's very important is the idea of you sacrificing the simplicity of the grenades for the complexity of the loose cannon, if you see what I mean. The loose cannon brings an extra dimension to the mechanics of the Demoman. So not only do you have to be very accurate with where you're shooting projectiles, you also have to consider the timing of your projectiles in a very new and different way, a very unique way to this weapon. In terms of damage and looking at the raw figures, it's very difficult to compare the two because every shot with the loose cannon differs quite significantly depending on if you get a double donk, if you just hit them and get the 50 base damage. All I will say is that once you get very proficient with the loose cannon, you can in fact do more damage, but it just takes a bit of getting used to. And I was very tempted to say that it's just harder to do, but I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's whatever you're used to. I've got hundreds of hours playing with the grenade launcher. I've got a few hours playing with the loose cannon. Of course I find it more difficult to use, more difficult to get those consistent double donks, but I would imagine if I played with it for a long time, actually, I felt myself improve just within like a few days of using it, right? So if you played with it for a long time, I would imagine that would get more consistent in terms of that damage output. And it's a tricky one because if you're really consistent with those double donks, you'd get more damage output, but still, most classes will need 2 hits. The main difference is a 125 HP class, you may be able to take down in 1 double donk. So that was my very quick overview, some of the key points and themes and thoughts I wanted to get across to you guys. I'm going to go into a little bit more depth now, talk more about my opinions on the weapon. So to begin with, it kind of suits the name, right? It feels really unreliable until you get used to it. If you first pick it up, 1 minute you do 50 damage, the next minute you're absolutely wrecking a scout in 1 hit. It takes a very long time to get to the point where it becomes reliable. But again, to be fair, the grenade launcher isn't so reliable itself, right? But there are some other important things to talk about here. So of course it's situational, as always. In some environments and situations, it's definitely a viable side grade. In others, less so, and it depends very much on the map. For instance, if you're playing in a very wide open map, you really can't spam those pills across the entire map to, for example, take out a sentry nest. It's just not possible with the loose cannon. I've found that it's better as a defensive weapon, especially when you're defending some kind of objective. If you can stay at the right kind of range from the objective so you don't have to think too much about the timing of your charge, you can very consistently start to get those double donks and put out loads of damage. And because of the hitbox size being bigger, you may find that you're actually getting out more damage without even trying. If you sit in that sweet spot, that nice distance away from, say, the cart or a control point, that's when you can start to rake in that damage fairly easily. So, as I said, it's not really a long-range weapon, but it's not actually a short-range weapon either. If you're suddenly face-to-face with a pyro or a scout or a demo knight, it's surprisingly difficult to deal with that threat quickly. Because if you want to do that maximum double donk damage, there's a triple D for you, that sounded lovely, you have to hold down the button and you can't immediately get the damage out. Sure, it's only a second or what have you, but still, it adds that pressure to you as well in that situation. As I said before, it doesn't have that immediate burst damage that a pipe will do. The moment you click that button, the moment it hits the enemy, 100 damage, done. Another thing I thought about was the idea of the grenade launcher being a very high risk, high reward weapon. But in reality, they kind of both are. They're both kind of all or nothing weapons, but they just have a different kind of risk and reward system. And as I mentioned before, the loose cannon gives you that extra dimension to think about. It's about timing as well as accuracy. And although in some respects it's actually easier to get some kind of damage out because the hitboxes are so big, getting the double donk I would say is more difficult than hitting a direct hit pipe, just because you have to think about that timing as well. Another aspect to the weapon is of course the knockback, which can frankly be absolutely amazing. It's so great at disrupting the enemy, pushing people off high ground, juggling people around so you can try and get that second hit onto them, although occasionally it does feel like it's working against you and pushing the enemies away from you. I will be talking about the knockback a little bit more when we get to the tips in just a second. One last thing to mention of course is the idea of loose cannon jumping. Now personally speaking, I find this is not a very practical way to get around the map. It takes away a load of health and it's not that easy to control. You'd be better off using a shield of some kind, or alternatively the iron bomber. I find that much more practical, you can take much less damage and it's easier to control. If you have a buff, you might be able to loose cannon jump into the front lines, or you may be able to use it in a rollout of some kind if you collect health along the way. But if you don't get health when you land, you're going to be at a crazy disadvantage. But personally, I've had a lot of fun with it alongside the sticky jumper. I think it works really well with this weapon, especially because of the fact that it's a kind of short to mid-range weapon. So you can jump into range, charge a quick shot up, try and get some double donks and then jump back out of there. A really fun way to play. So if you want to try it out, I recommend using the sticky jumper too, because it also forces you to use it constantly and therefore you'll learn much quicker. So I just wanted to create a very quick summary, a very quick list of all the strengths and weaknesses of this weapon. The ones I've thought of anyway, so feel free to jump in the comments below and let me know if I've missed anything. So, strengths. It's great for objectives and choke points, especially if you're standing at the perfect distance away. It's great for denying and disrupting with the knockback. There is more potential damage. It's great against heavies because they're so slow and therefore you're more likely to get that double donk. And it's great for finishing off, using the big hitbox, just getting 50 damage out to finish off a retreating player. Now over to the weaknesses. It's really bad against sentry guns. It can't do long range spam, and you can't do the kind of long range area control that you might do with pipes. It's not ideal in sudden close range conflict. You just don't have that immediate burst damage that the pipes have. It's not great at jumping. I mean, this could be a strength or a weakness. You can jump with it, but there are much better options out there for jumping. And the final very nuanced weakness, it's difficult when enemies are moving towards and away from you rapidly. Very good tip if you're against a loose cannon. Don't just dodge from side to side like normally. If you're dodging forwards and backwards as well, it makes it very difficult for the enemy to predict to get that double donk. Okay, so we're going to end this episode with a few random tips. They're going to be a bit jumbled and all over the place, but a few things that I noted down whilst playing with the weapon, things that I've personally found very useful in my gameplay. So we'll start with one that I briefly already mentioned, the idea of staying at the right range from your enemy if possible, or from the objective. This will mean that the majority of your shots you don't have to think about the timing, you can just spam in those cannonballs and rake in those double donks. Also bear in mind that you can use yourself instead of the charge, and what I mean by that is, to fine tune the charge so to speak, you can move yourself backwards and forwards to help get that right distance away for the double donk. Following from that, generally speaking, if they're moving away from you, you need to hold the charge down for less, and if they're moving towards you, you need to hold the charge down for a bit more than usual. One thing that I found is that too little charge is probably better than too much, because remember, to get the double donk you need to knock them first and then do explosion damage. It doesn't matter if it knocks them and flies up in the air a little bit and then finally explodes. It doesn't have to be instantaneous, there can be a little bit of a gap in between the two things. Even at very close range, I don't really feel like I need to charge the shot any more than say 3/4 of the bar. Another great tip is to pre-charge. So if you're coming around a corner, you're a little bit terrified of meeting a pyro, just pre-charge a shot up so that if there's one in front of your face, you're prepared and you can immediately get damage out. Of course, be careful not to damage yourself as you're doing this. Also, you can just simply pre-fire, basically spam, right? Corners, choke points. Don't feel like you need to wait until you see the enemy. Constantly fire at those choke points at the objective, wherever you think the enemies are going to be coming from. One thing I noticed myself doing a lot is getting a double donk, then finishing off with a quick tap of a second cannonball, not worrying too much about getting the second double donk. Remember, not every single shot needs to be a double donk. Sometimes that 50 damage is enough just to finish them off. Another random tip, but you can actually bounce your cannonballs off the ground to slow them down. A little bit weird, but you know, occasionally I found that useful. And a really important tip that has screwed me over so many times: make sure you reload before going into combat. I mean, obviously make sure you reload, but it really screws with your timing if you're not loaded. So maybe I had a second weapon out, I switch over, I press the charge button, I haven't even reloaded yet, I let go, and I've charged the weapon much less than I thought. So yeah, just be really careful with that, make sure you're reloaded, because if you're not, it can really screw with your timings. Finally, a few tips about the knockback. So the knockback will vary depending on where you hit them. If you hit them in the legs, they'll move up. In the body, they'll move back. In the head, they won't move so much. So in reality, getting a headshot can actually be a very useful strategy for getting the double donk. Or you may prefer to knock them up in the air, because once they're knocked in the air, you can predict where they're going to be going next. So the knockback can obviously be really useful for like demo knights or pyros who are up in your face. It's a great way just to slow them down, and sometimes in dire situations, forget about the double donk, just try and knock them back a little bit and get out of there. And finally, like I said, knockback is a great tool for many situations. Two of the main ones being knocking people off high ground and denying Ubers. I just wanted to finish off with this little clip I found from TF2. It was 7 versus Low Panda, and it's a little bit of an old game from last year. When I saw it, I bookmarked it because I wanted to make sure I put it in this video. It's a great example of making great use of that knockback to deny an Uber. And if they're doing it at this level, it can't be a bad thing, right? So I hope you enjoyed this video. Those were my thoughts on the loose cannon. If you get good at it, it can be a viable side grade in certain situations. Because in reality it's not great in every map. I wouldn't recommend it perhaps on some very open maps if the enemy has a bunch of sentry nests. But that being said, as soon as you get proficient with this thing, I think it could really be a viable option for the demo man. I haven't got good at it yet, so I'm not going to be switching over to it just because I'm much more experienced with the pipes. But actually I wanted to end on the most important thing for me, and that is how enjoyable is each weapon, how satisfying is each one to use. To begin with, I was like, nothing will beat the satisfaction of getting a direct hit with a pipe, but in reality, the double donks feel pretty good, man, feel pretty good. So I think both weapons can be really fun to use, and if the gameplay is getting a bit stale, I definitely recommend switching over to the loose cannon, having a mess around with it, because it's such a great fun weapon to use. Anyway, as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did I miss any tips or tricks? I'm sure I did, so let me know in the comments below. Let me know what weapon you want me to talk about next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
Teacher!